The rain had started before dawn. By 7 in the morning, the cemetery was covered in gray clouds, wet grass, and dozens of black umbrellas. I stood beside my mother's coffin, staring at the flowers people had brought. White roses. Lilies. Mom had always loved lilies. She used to say they made every room feel peaceful. Now they surrounded the coffin where she lay. I still couldn't believe she was gone. 3 days earlier, I had been sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand while the machines quietly beeped. She had looked exhausted, but she had smiled at me. "Take care of your father," she'd whispered. I had squeezed her hand. "You tell him yourself." She smiled again. "I will." Those were the last words my mother ever said to me. 3 days later, I was standing over her grave. My father stood beside me. He looked completely broken. My parents had been married for 41 years. They had built a life together. They had raised 2 children. They had survived financial problems, illnesses, arguments, vacations, birthdays, holidays, and everything else life had thrown at them. And now my father had to watch the woman he'd loved for most of his life disappear beneath the earth. I reached for his hand. He squeezed mine. Neither of us said anything. There were no words big enough for that moment. My husband wasn't there. Daniel had decided not to attend. At first, he'd told me he couldn't get away from work. Then he said funerals made him uncomfortable. Then he said he'd call me later. I had stopped trying to understand him. My mother was being buried. That was all that mattered. The minister began speaking. I tried to listen. He talked about Mom's kindness, her generosity, her laugh, the way she made people feel welcome. I looked at Dad. His eyes were closed. A tear rolled down his cheek. I squeezed his hand again. Then my phone vibrated. I ignored it. It vibrated again. I looked down. "Daniel." I turned the phone over. A few seconds later, it vibrated again. My cousin leaned toward me. "Are you okay?" I nodded. "I'm fine." But I wasn't. My phone rang. I rejected the call. It rang again. My father noticed. "Maybe you should answer." I shook my head. "Not now." He looked at me. "Are you sure?" "Yes." The phone stopped. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then it rang again. "Daniel." I stared at the screen. Something inside me told me to answer. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe something had happened. Maybe he had finally realized what today meant. I stepped a few feet away from the group. "Hello. Where are you?" His voice sounded irritated. I looked at the coffin. "You know where I am. I know you're at the funeral." "Then why are you asking?" "Because you've ignored me all morning." I closed my eyes. "Daniel, this isn't the time. You've been gone since yesterday. My mother died." I know. The way he said it made my stomach tighten. Not sadness. Not sympathy. Just irritation. I lowered my voice. "Please don't do this." "Do what?" "Start an argument." "I'm not starting an argument. You called me 3 times during my mother's funeral. Because you aren't answering me. I shouldn't have to." There was a pause. Then he said, "You always do this." I frowned. "Do what?" "Put your family before me." I stared at the rain falling on the cemetery grass. "My mother is dead. I know she's dead." His words hit me harder than I expected. "Then why are you talking like this?" "Because I'm your husband." I didn't answer. He continued, "I should be the person you're thinking about." I looked toward my father. He was still standing beside the coffin. "Daniel, I'm thinking about my mother." "Exactly. What does that mean?" "It means you've always put her first." I felt anger replacing the grief in my chest. She was my mother. And I'm your husband. That doesn't mean I stopped being her daughter. I never said that. You don't have to. He sighed. "I needed you today." I almost laughed. "You needed me?" "Yes." "For what?" "I don't know." His answer made me even angrier. "You don't know?" "I just wanted you home." "I am exactly where I need to be." "With your family." "Yes." "Instead of me." I stared at the coffin. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I whispered, "Daniel, my father just lost his wife. You still have responsibilities to me." I turned away from everyone. "What responsibilities?" "I'm your husband." "You keep saying that." "Because you don't seem to understand." "No." My voice shook. "I don't understand how you can stand there and demand my attention while I'm burying my mother." He became silent. Then his voice hardened. "You should leave." I thought I'd misheard him. "What? Leave the funeral? Are you serious?" "Yes." "I can't believe you just said that." "You can come home and we can talk." "No." "What?" "I'm not leaving. You need to put this marriage first." I felt my hands trembling. "You are asking me to leave my mother's funeral." "I'm asking you to choose me." "Why?" "Because I'm your husband." I looked around. Everyone was still listening to the minister. Nobody knew what was happening. Or so I thought. Then Daniel said the sentence that made my blood run cold. Put me before your mother. Everything inside me stopped. I couldn't breathe. For several seconds, I simply stood there with the phone pressed against my ear. I looked at the coffin, at the flowers, at my father's trembling shoulders, at the photograph of my mother placed beside the flowers, and I realized Daniel wasn't asking for reassurance. He was demanding that I prove my love by abandoning her at the moment she needed me most. I whispered, "How could you say that?" "Because I'm tired of coming second. She's dead." "I know." "Then you should understand why I'm here." "I understand that you always choose them." I shook my head. "No." "What?" "I choose what is right." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm staying." He became angry. "You never listened to me." "I've listened for years." "Then listen now." "I am." "Come home." "No." "You're really choosing your mother over your husband?" I looked at my father's face. Then I answered, "I'm choosing not to abandon my father while he buries his wife." There was silence. Then Daniel said, "Fine." I thought the conversation was over. But he wasn't finished. "I'm going to remember this." I swallowed. "Remember whatever you want." He hung up. I lowered the phone. My hands were still shaking. Then I noticed something strange. My cousin was staring at me. Then another relative looked over. Then another. I glanced toward the portable speaker near the minister. My heart dropped. The phone had been connected to the cemetery speaker system. Daniel's voice hadn't been private. Everyone had heard him. My face went pale. I looked toward my father. He was staring directly at me. Then he slowly walked over. "What did he say?" I couldn't answer. Dad looked at the phone. "Give it to me." I hesitated. "Please." I handed it over. Dad lifted the phone. Daniel was still connected. "Hello." Daniel answered immediately. Finally. Dad said nothing. Daniel continued. "Maybe she'll listen to you." My father's expression changed. His grief turned into something else. Something calm. Something stronger. "Daniel." There was silence. "Who is this?" "You know who I am." Daniel paused. "Sir." "Her father." Another silence. Dad looked at my mother's coffin. Then he looked at me. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. But everyone around us could hear every word. "You told my daughter to put you before her mother." Daniel tried to respond. Dad raised his hand. "No. You don't get to explain. You had your chance." Daniel went silent. Dad continued. "My wife is lying in that coffin. My daughter is standing here trying to bury her. And you called her to demand that she leave." "Yes. I wanted her home." Dad nodded slowly. "Then you have misunderstood what marriage means." Daniel said something. Dad interrupted him. "My daughter doesn't know you first place in every moment of her life. Especially not this one." He looked at me. "She is a daughter before she is a wife today." Then he turned toward the coffin. "And I am a husband who just lost his wife." His voice cracked. "But I would never ask my daughter to choose between us." The cemetery had gone completely silent. Even the minister had stopped speaking. Dad took a breath. "You wanted her attention? You have it. But you are not going to use her mother's death to control her." Daniel didn't respond. Dad's voice became firmer. "If you love her, you will let her grieve. If you don't, then you need to decide what kind of husband you really are." He handed the phone back to me. I looked at the screen. Daniel was still there. For a moment, I considered saying something. Anything. But I was exhausted. My mother was still lying in front of me. My father was still grieving beside me. And I had finally realized that this wasn't about choosing between two people. It was about whether the person I married could respect the people I loved. I raised the phone to my ear. "Daniel, I'm here. I'll come home after the funeral." "Okay. But we're going to have a serious conversation." "Okay. And after today, things are going to change." He was silent. I ended the call. Then I walked back toward my father's side. He reached for my hand. I held it. The minister resumed the service. Rain continued falling. And as I stood beside my mother's coffin, I realized that the hardest part of the day hadn't even begun. Because after the funeral, I would have to go home and face the man who had demanded that I choose between being his wife and being my mother's daughter. That evening, I didn't go home with Daniel. I went to my father's house. The same house where I had grown up. The same house where my mother had cooked Sunday dinners, wrapped birthday presents, argued with Dad over whose turn it was to wash the dishes, and danced around the kitchen whenever her favorite song came on the radio. Everything looked exactly the same. And somehow, that made her absence hurt even more. Her favorite blue mug was still sitting beside the sink. Her slippers were still near the couch. A half-finished knitting project rested in a basket beside her chair. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and started crying. Dad walked in behind me. He didn't say anything. He simply put his arms around me. We stood there together. Two people trying to understand how a house could still look so much like home when the person who made it feel like home was gone. After several minutes, Dad whispered, "She loved you very much." "I know. She worried about you." I looked at him. "About what?" He hesitated. "About your marriage." My heart sank. "What did she say?" Dad sat down at the kitchen table. "She didn't want to interfere. But she thought you were always trying too hard to keep everyone happy." I wiped my tears. She was probably right. Dad smiled sadly. "Your mother usually was." I laughed through my tears. For the first time that day, I smiled. Then Dad became serious. "She told me something a few months ago." "What?" "She said she didn't want you to spend your whole life apologizing for loving people." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "She said Daniel sometimes made you feel guilty for spending time with your family." I looked down. "He does." Dad nodded. "I know. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to see it yourself." I swallowed. I thought I was imagining things. You weren't. My phone rang. "Daniel." I stared at the screen. Dad didn't tell me whether to answer. He simply waited. Finally, I picked up. "What?" "I'm sorry." His voice sounded different. Quieter. "I shouldn't have called you." "No." "I shouldn't have said what I said." "No." "I was angry." "You were angry because I was burying my mother." "I know." "You made me feel like I had done something wrong by grieving." "I know." I sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said, "I've been thinking about what your father said." I looked at Dad. "What did he say?" "That I don't get to demand first place in your heart." I closed my eyes. "He's right." "I know. And I think I've been confusing being important to you with being entitled to you." That sentence surprised me. I had expected another argument. Instead, I heard something I hadn't heard from Daniel in years. Accountability. I took a breath. "Why did you do it?" "I don't know." "That's not enough." He was silent. Then he said, "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of losing you." I frowned. "You weren't losing me." I felt like I was. Because I spent time with my parents? Because I always felt like there was someone else you needed. I shook my head. "Daniel, that's life." "I know. Marriage doesn't mean the rest of your family disappears." "I understand that now." I looked toward the hallway where my mother's photographs hung. "You didn't understand it today." "I know. You asked me to leave her funeral." "I know. You said I should put you before her." "I know. That isn't something I can forget because you apologized." "I don't expect you to." I was quiet. Then he asked, "Do you still love me?" I looked at the phone.